Okay. Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. Please do subscribe. This will be about Whig propaganda and the Glorious Revolution. Traditionally, the birth of a prince is cause for joy. A royal son means renewal, stability, and continuity for the nation, both symbolically and literally. Conversely, infertility in a queen produces anxiety. Think of the extremes Henry VIII went to produce a male heir. Having grown up in the shadow of the Wars of the Roses, Henry knew how crucial it was to ensure his line. Normally, whenever a royal child is born, everyone celebrates. But the birth of one royal boy produced such panic among Whig elites that it prompted the overthrow of the monarch. That monarch was James II and VII, the last Catholic king of England, Ireland, and Scotland. James's enemies became jumpy as soon as his second wife, Mary of Modena, announced her pregnancy. Would it be a son? Up to that moment, it had seemed that the throne would pass to his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. Both Mary and her sister Anne had been raised Protestant at the insistence of their pragmatic uncle, Charles II. Now, however, the prospect of a Catholic succession opened up. The Whigs responded with a propaganda blizzard so fierce that the monarchy was already destabilized when the baby, baptized James Francis Edward Stuart, was born on June 5, 1688. In the 17th century, the traditional right of succession lay at the foundation of the world. It was no small thing to dethrone a legitimate king and deny his son. Because of this, the propaganda designed to reshape public opinion had to be relentless and operatic in intensity. The very name of the project, Glorious Revolution, radiates persuasion. Ultimately, the propagandists relegated the healthy new Prince of Wales to the status of a shadowy changeling. King James's enemies began casting aspersions upon his child while it was still in the womb. They humiliated Mary of Modena, the queen who had once dreamed of becoming a nun. Some of the rumors originated in the palace. Princess Anne, who stood to lose her place in the succession, was complicit in raising doubts about her stepmother's pregnancy. Mary of Modena had been pregnant a number of times in the past without drawing much fire. She had suffered many miscarriages and endured the death of infants. This pregnancy had come about after a trip to the spa town of Bath. The difference was that this time her husband, James, had acceded to the throne. Writing to her sister Mary in Holland, Princess Anne claims that the Queen shies away from her touch. Anne implies that Mary of Modena was faking her pregnancy, perhaps with a false belly. Pointing the finger at her Catholic relatives, she concludes darkly, quote, "They will stick at nothing, be it never so wicked, if it will promote their interest. There may be foul play intended," unquote. It seems that this gossip then spread through the Dutch court and back across the Channel. With the phrase foul play, Princess Anne had raised the old spectre of a supposititious child. Soon, before Prince James was even born, the notion of a changeling in the royal palace had taken hold in the popular imagination. There is a rich vein of changeling lore in our traditions. The changeling is a fairy child, uncanny, a stranger. It's believed that fairies, elves, and sometimes trolls kidnap human children, leaving an otherworldly babe in the crib. The changeling is weird. It looks wizened. Demanding and voracious, it nonetheless wastes away. It can be a kind of parasite, leeching the family's resources without thriving. Folklore lists tricks to make the changeling admit to its fairy origins. Only then will it vanish. Only then can the human child be recovered, unless it's eaten fairy food, in which case it's too late. The human child will always have one foot in fairyland. These strategies include surprising the changeling into sudden laughter, or beating it with switches until it confesses its true identity. unbaptized babies are vulnerable to fairy abduction. And of course, this Prince of Wales would never be baptized Protestant. Overall, the Changeling designation dehumanized and, crucially, delegitimized the Prince of Wales, setting the stage for his banishment. Having caught wind of the malicious rumors, King James saw to it that at least 70 witnesses were present when Mary of Modena gave birth at St. James's Palace on June 1688. The king invited his daughter Anne, but she refused to attend, preferring to cling to her dark imaginings. The palace announced the birth of the Prince of Wales, and there were fireworks on the Thames and celebratory poems from figures like John Dryden, then poet laureate, calling the child a son of prayers. Dryden writes in part, quote, "See how the venerable infant lies, in early pomp, how through the mother's eyes the father's soul looks out, and takes our homage as his due," unquote. The palace issued commemorative prints replete with auspicious imagery. Here's one that seems to illustrate the Dryden lines. It shows a healthy Prince James in ermine, looking quite reflective, even conscientious, a crown embossed above his head. In this one, the infant seems poised to spring into action. Angels, God's messengers, hover, ready to coronate him. In a third, the queen demurely rocks her precious son in his cradle. James's enemies parodied these works mercilessly. The Whigs employed artists from William's circles at a time when Dutch artistry had a particular edge in Europe. Here we see the same scene as previously, down to the decorative details, only here this queen is distracted, canoodling with a Catholic priest. Of course, all these efforts were designed to mine a deep seam of anti-Catholicism in England. The implication is that the priest, the king's chaplain, Father Edward Peter, is the baby's true father, and that Catholicism is the true power in court. It invites us to mock, sneer, and shake our heads at what should be a joyous and unifying occasion. William's camp also produced pro-William prints, medals, and even playing cards. Some materials pointed to the priest, while others suggested that the real father was a lowly miller. Some made both accusations at once. In this print, we see mother and baby at lower left. The queen is being wooed by a cleric. Meanwhile, the baby holds a tiny windmill, the emblem of his supposed father. King James lies in bed, surrounded by priests and wicked counselors, and vomiting nasty-looking tiny creatures wearing mitres and spewing evil ideas in turn. The court is depicted as infested with malign influences. The particular genius of the warming pan baby smear was to make a generic bedroom farce out of a sacred event. We know this form of mental theater was successful because, of all the mud lobbed at the court of James II, the story of the warming pan baby has stuck. The narrative that an impostor prince had been smuggled inside a black brass implement through the palace, past the crowd of witnesses, and into the queen's bed is objectively silly. But the story was successful not despite the fact that it was ridiculous, but because it was ridiculous. The whole scenario is crafted to provoke prurient interest and scornful laughter. The humble bedroom appliance is something that a chambermaid would slide between the sheets on a chilly night. The warming pan prop fit in perfectly with the standard Restoration comedy elements: bedroom, adultery, secrecy, hypocrisy, and scrambling servants, so familiar to an audience of the time. It reduced the royal birth to a ludicrous sideshow. One of the Whigs' most effective propagandists was Daniel Defoe, who later authored Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe. As a young man, Defoe was known for his revolutionary politics. He was born in London circa 1660, the year the Stuarts were restored. Since his family were Presbyterians, out of conformity with the Church of England, Daniel was schooled at dissenting academies. The son of a prosperous Flemish tallow chandler called James Foe, Daniel styled himself Defoe in an effort to sound more distinguished. His was the profile of a typical Whig supporter, ambitious, a dissenting Protestant, anti-Catholic and anti-French, skeptical of monarchic power, a tradesman with ties to the Netherlands. As a young man, Defoe manifested a taste for political intrigue by joining the Whig party's sweetheart, the Duke of Monmouth, in his 1685 rebellion against King James. But it was Defoe's writing talent that would make him valuable to the Whigs. He didn't coin the name Glorious Revolution. That was his contemporary, Whig zealot John Hampden. But Defoe's pamphlet flurry helped to reshape public opinion, topple King James, and secure William of Orange as the de facto monarch of the three kingdoms. The pamphlets were printed in great numbers and then circulated widely, for instance to the coffee houses, where they would be read aloud and discussed. William of Orange brought along a printing press when he invaded England on November 5, 1688, intentionally echoing the gunpowder plot, just when the English public, building their bonfires and fashioning their Guy Fawkes effigies, would be focused on the theme of foiling Catholic skullduggery. The first Defoe pamphlet is called The Advantages of the Present Settlement and the Dangers of a Relapse. In it, he poses as an everyman member of the Church of England because the revolution could succeed only if King James lost this traditional base of support. Defoe writes, quote, that there was a design to subvert the established religion of this kingdom. I hope no man will so much as question, unquote. He advances a series of collocations, or word associations. For example, he repeatedly fuses popery with slavery. James's efforts to include Catholics in public life is presented as self-evidently awful. William of Orange, meanwhile, equals deliverance. He is, quote, the instrument of our deliverance and our potent deliverer, unquote. Finally, James Francis Edward is never named. Instead, Defoe refers to the pretended Prince of Wales. The phrase is alliterative and therefore memorable. He cites, for example, that affair of the pretended Prince of Wales, claiming that, quote, not only this whole nation was violently suspicious, upon very great grounds, but likewise the intended fraud was the discourse of Europe, unquote. Whig propaganda blighted the life of Prince James Francis Edward and overshadowed his identity. Since the king, James, mistrusted the Whigs, whose Puritan predecessors had executed his father, Charles I, he took his queen and young son to safety at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. From there, the, quote, pretended Prince of Wales, unquote, went on to haunt popular fancy as the Pretender. One of Defoe's later pamphlets featured the jittery title, And What If the Pretender Should Come? The prince's existence continued precarious. Living in the margins of British public life, exiled on the continent, he periodically mounted campaigns to retake the throne. Once he had married Maria Clementina Sobieska and had an heir in Bonnie Prince Charlie, he became the old pretender to his enemies. To his friends, he was the old chevalier. Both James II and his deposer, William III, died in 1701. The latter's horse had thrown him after stumbling over a molehill, prompting Jacobites to toast the little gentleman in black velvet waistcoat ever after. 1701 was both momentous and frustrating for James Francis Edward. On the one hand, Louis XIV recognized him as James III of the Three Kingdoms. On the other, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement, which explicitly barred Catholics from the throne and mandated that, quote, the monarch shall join in communion with the Church of England, unquote. That was something James Francis Edward consistently refused to do. So, ultimately, the Catholic faith that had placed him beyond the pale of the English state also informed and gave shape to his life and dignity to his death. If you tour the Vatican, you can visit his tomb at the Stuart Monument. The words of an Irish captain who traveled with him give us a glimpse of the real man behind the distortions. The old Chevalier, quote, possessed all the qualities of a great prince and those of a most honest private gentleman, unquote. Thank you for listening. Please do offer your comments below, and I will see you next time.